Welcome to the Economic and Political History Podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas on the intersection of economics, political science, and history.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Economic and Political History Podcast. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. And today I'm thrilled to be joined by Lisa Lucero. She is professor of anthropology at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and she's the author of a book recently published by Oxford University Press called Maya Wisdom and the Survival of Our Planet. I'm very excited of being here with Lisa. Lisa, how are you?
I'm very well. Thank you, Javier. Thank you for having me.
No, I'm very excited to have you here, and I would like to start with a question about your background and your intellectual origins. You're an archaeologist. You have worked for many years in the Maya territory. I want to hear about the path that took you there. And I'm also curious about how is the career of an archaeologist end up in a path that is so specialized in a set of specific sites, right? So I'm very curious about how you end up working in one of, for instance, the many sites of the Maya territory. Tell me about that. Bring any personal anecdote that you think it's important and that has been relevant in your path, please.
Great. Yes. Well, my journey has been, for me, interesting. I traveled the world when I was very young, but not through literally traveling, but through books, historical fiction, anything I would just read so much. And so I read various things and it just described the world. And it got me interested in the world. And then in my high school, Mr. Arnold in social sciences taught us about anthropology, which is not done typically in high school. So I entered Colorado State interested in anthropology, and I focused in physical anthropology and cultural anthropology, but I always wanted to go into archaeology. So I knew by my sophomore year that I wanted to get my PhD with a focus in archaeology. But also at the time when I was growing up, Star Wars came out, Indiana Jones, and all those kind of action, these sort of novel, sort of cutting edge kind of movies that sort of impacted my imagination. So my journey is one of imagination since our family didn't have a lot of money to travel to these places specifically. But books just open up a whole new world. And I wanted to explore more. I wanted to learn more. So that's why education was so important to me. And I went to UCLA, which was great. I loved living in Los Angeles. You could be a poor graduate student and take buses everywhere to the beach. And I got to work with some really amazing professors who taught me a lot. And I soon became interested in this main question. How did leaders acquire power over others? How did political power develop? And that led me to reading lots of theories and books. And then when you start to read the archaeological literature and other kind of literature, you realize, and when I start to go into the field, I realized that you can't understand political power and leadership unless you understood the common folk, the 99 percenters. So when I was at UCLA, we had a visiting archaeology professor there, Dr. Annabelle Ford from UC Santa Barbara, who invited me to join her lab and go to the field with her after I obtained my MA. Because at UCLA, they encourage you to get to focus on something different for your PhD than you did for your MA. And for my MA, I worked on a former Lucero properties land grant by the Spanish government in the 1600s, where there was some rock art. So I did solar astronomy. So I needed something totally different from Pueblo solar astronomy. And Annabelle introduced me to the world of the ancestral Maya. So I went to Belize in 1988 as a graduate student. That was my first time. And I'd never been to a humid area. And the jungles themselves is an amazing place. But the more I worked with Annabelle, and she was doing settlement study, looking at different sizes of houses and cities, again, it made me realize you can't understand political systems until you understand the people, how they subsisted, their economic system, everything about them. And then that got me going on understanding another major role in politics was how the seasons, there's annual dry season and annual rainy season, and the rainfall dependent. The ancestral Maya were rainfall dependent. So you have to plant exactly at the right time. If the rains come too late or too soon, it could totally mess the agricultural season, or too much, and then there's hurricanes. And then there's annual drought where it doesn't rain for 5 months. So how did they deal with these differences? And it made me realize that this climate instability, whether it be yearly, the annual wet dry season, or over the long term, like naturally caused episodes of long, severe droughts, for example, really impacted the nature of political power and kingship. And so that led me to climate change. And then that was about 20 years ago. So this was before climate change really started to make news in today's world. So the Maya, past and present, led me on my journey because I work alongside the Maya. All of my foreman and excavation assistants are Maya, Mopan or Echi or various kinds of Maya. And I also work, of course, along my students and my graduate students and Beletian students when I'm lucky enough to have them along. So I've learned a lot from people, the Maya, as well as from the archaeological record. And that's led me to where I am today, continuing spreading the message of what I've learned from the traditional Maya and the ancestral Maya, is that you can collaborate and live alongside nature without destroying it, which is what we are doing at present.
Let me ask you more about that path. And it's interesting, and this is something that I sort of discover as I've approached archaeology as an outsider. I'm an economist, and with this growing interest for archaeology, and something that you see quite present in today's work in archaeology is, among many other things, is the attention to community engagement, right? So it's very common now if you go to a presentation of the top archaeologists today that they would show you pictures of what they do with the communities and so on. And that sounds to me something that contrasts with this classical Indiana Jones idea of what an archaeology used to do. And my sense is that that's one of the dimensions in which the profession has changed in the last few decades. So I want to hear about your experience in seeing the field change over the several decades you've been working on it. And I guess that's one dimension. So I guess the cultural evolution and the preferences and pressures in the field, but also technology is something that has changed profoundly. I know that in the Mayan field, LiDAR has been particularly important. So tell me about that. Like how different is the field today than what it was 30 years ago?
Yeah, archaeology has changed a lot. And, Indiana Jones was an extreme case. So I always show the first 10 minutes of the first one when he, does all this destruction to show my archaeology students what not to do. Because it's very slow going, it's very meticulous, because the archaeology is a destructive field. Once we remove, human remains, for example, from a burial, once we remove a brick from a wall, we can't put it back exactly to how it was. So that's why we draw and we take meticulous notes and photographs and do everything. And previously, prior to LiDAR, doing survey of the jungle was walking transects because it was just all jungle. You can't map everything because there's so much vegetation. There are so many bushes and trees and all of this. You can't see everything. LiDAR opened up a whole new world, and it is amazing. And to me, it's magic. But another thing that's really changed is that the whole field of anthropology and many other social sciences and fields are decolonizing anthropology. So basically all these foreigners come in and impose their Western biased ideas about, trying to apply capitalism or communism or different kinds of economic systems that have no bearing on how things were, which has totally changed, especially in the last 10 years. There's still issues, I still am very much aware. I get my NSF. I get permission 2 months prior from the Institute. Hoping they give me permission. I go in, get my permit, hire my usual team, do the thing for 6 to 8 weeks, and then leave. So I have given, of course, you get back reports. I give copies of all my reports to my crew in the Valley of Peace Village where they live. And of course, to the Institute of Archaeology. But there's still an aspect of some of the terminology we use. So instead of burials, we're using ancestors. We're acknowledging that these were living people. These are not scientific objects for us to impose our models that have nothing to do with them per se. That doesn't mean we give up models or theories to try to explain, but it makes us more aware, and it makes it even more critical to communicate and consult with traditional Maya and other peoples because their oral histories and their stories from living there for thousands and thousands of years have a bearing on how we should, explain along with our those with whom we collaborate in Belize or elsewhere in the Maya area or wherever we go. So that's been a big movement. So you've got the technology aspect where you have all of this great magic, as I'm calling it, and then you have us being more reflexive in how colonial it has been. We are not allowed to take, for example, beautifully painted vessels anymore without permission. I get permission to export, for example, ceramic sherds if necessary, but only if necessary. We do most of our lab work in Belize. But carbon samples for radiocarbon dates, we get permission to bring back human remains samples and teeth to do isotopic analysis, but not the whole skeleton unless there's absolute need for it. And then it's always the property of the Belize government, the Institute of Archaeology. So there's all these strict guidelines of what you can export and the conditions under which they have to be curated in the United States or elsewhere. So it's a changing world and all for the better to help protect Maya cultural heritage, both in the field, underground, as well as in the lab or in the storage facilities and in museums, because we still have a major problem with black market. So when you go to an art history museum, it'll, see those beautiful jade pieces or ceramic vessels, and you'll see Maya, classic period, Guatemala. That goes to show that it's been looted because there's not information from what city it comes from which palace or what structure, which level, and that is on loan from the Belize government or Mexican government or Guatemalan government. So, and many of these governments would like some of these things back.
That's very interesting. And I want us to get back to this later and in terms of like how you interact with the Maya community today. But before that, I would like to help us getting into the ground, right? So you mentioned already how important it was for you, the geographical and ecological conditions of Belize, and that was one of the things that surprised you early on, and that's important in your book, right? And I noticed there are two important or two concepts that are crucial in the way you frame things. You talk about the seasonality and the dispersion of both flora, fauna, population. So tell me about that. Help us transport ourselves to the Maya area. Tell us how it looks like geographic and climatic and ecological wise. And let's build on top of that then your big story.
Okay, the tropical world is beautiful and dangerous and hot and humid and colorful. The vibrancy, the cacophony, it's really an amazing place. The seasonality is extreme. Very, very dry during the 5-month dry season from about late January through mid-June. And then the rainy season, the rest of the year, where 90% of the rainfall falls. And so you have these two worlds, basically very wet and very dry. And so the Maya adapted to both. So the rainy season is the agricultural intensive period. And in tropical areas, and this is common throughout all the tropical world, you have different agricultural soil types that are dispersed. You don't have like broad alluvium, for example. You have different sized pockets of different soils that reflect agricultural fertility, but also biodiversity in terms of the jungle life, flora and fauna. So during the agricultural intensive period, you have all these rural farmers that in the past were dispersed to mirror the dispersed nature of the soils. But during the dry season, this is when it doesn't rain, and this is when creeks and aguadas, which are natural sinkholes they line with clay that contain water, they become desiccated. So the issue is, what did they do during this dry season when it was the non-agricultural period? This is when they concentrate into centers because they had massive artificial reservoirs that supplied clean drinking water throughout the long dry season. And this is when there are ceremonies of pomp and circumstance, ball games, markets. And this is also when the subjects of the kings would build and maintain the palaces and ball courts and temples and plazas and everything like that. So the jungle is a pulsating system ecologically, but it also impacts the social and political system, which is also pulsating, along with the seasonal pulses, if you will. So I argue that power, Maya world power, was somewhat seasonal, based on the seasonal fluctuation. Decentralized, dispersed during the rainy season when everyone had plenty of water, and the agriculture intensive period, and soils were dispersed like everything else. And then you have centralization when this is when people during the dry season and non agricultural period, when people needed access to water. So you have these massive reservoirs that were also self-cleaning and lasted for over 1,000 years. So I think it's pretty clear what some of the lessons are, which I detail at the end of the book, in terms of what we can learn from the ancestral Maya.
So, and how much continuity is in these practices and this type of society, generally speaking, right? Because we're talking, when you're talking, and here I guess I'm asking you to give us also a sort of context, social wise, right? So, when you talk about the ancient Mayas, who are these people and how much of them are a continuous entity or society or culture, and for how long should we then think about them? What things persist, what things change? How can you frame us in this type of societies?
The Maya lowlands have some of the largest amount of some of the best tropical soils in the world. And over time, hunters and gatherers, we had the same story you see everywhere. We have very small nomadic hunters and gatherers. And over time, due to the plethora of flora and fauna and game and everything, population grows. Humans are great at adapting, in terms of cultural adaptation and taking advantage and learning about where they lived. So we're talking thousands of years of doing this. And then eventually they adopted the use of domesticated plants, especially maize from central Mexico and beans from South America. The information, the knowledge spread, and also then the major staples became maize, beans, and squash, and manioc, and a plethora of other kinds of domesticated and non-domesticated plants. And because they were so successful, communities grew over time, and more people. The more and more people you have living in any given area, the more you need administration, the more you need to organize, the more you need to resolve disputes. And somebody emerges for various reasons and using ritual and ceremony and convincing peoples. I mean, it sounds familiar, yeah, during elections. And basically, they serve a role to keep everything in check. And let's face it, have you ever heard of a political leader doing anything for free? No.
Not really.
No. It's an oxymoron to say that they do it for free. An oxymoron concept, I should say. So over time, these leaders get bigger houses, and you see this increased evolution or emergence of hierarchy, the haves and have-nots. But during the decentralized agricultural intensive period, rural farmers are basically on their own. But when they come during the dry season, they reemerge from these decentralized hierarchical systems, community-based decisions, to these hierarchical structures. And the cities grow over more and more time. And there are hundreds of cities and hundreds of kings or leaders. Some are more powerful than others, like at Tikal. So we see the emergence of kingship about 100 BCE. And in the southern Maya lowlands, which is northern Guatemala, southeastern Mexico, and all of Belize, that's the southern Maya lowlands, we see this emergence, again, about 100 BCE through 900 CE. So the kingship lasted for over 1,000 years, even with the somewhat seasonal nature of it, which is amazing. What is it? An amazing accomplishment. It truly is that they had this really great system, this urban-rural network that lasted. And it lasted because they fulfilled each other's needs and providing clean water during the dry season. And so what you also get during the dry season, this is likely when they made the beautiful mantas, the beautiful textiles, and also the jade items, and also the beautifully painted vessels, and also the plastering and construction of all the buildings, the maintenance, and of the reservoir systems. and to the Sauk Bay or the causeways. This is what during the dry season, this is when you're doing all this construction and all the markets and ceremonies, which would make sense where everyone is together. And there's plenty of food. And because they still have lots of forests around them. To our knowledge, the Maya did not cause the extinction of any plants and animals. And we know there are forests throughout urban areas. They literally were green cities because of the pollen, the paleobotanicals found in sediment cores. You just collect all these sediments through time and you can date them using radiocarbon. But you can identify all the different species of plants. And also animal bones, which is the identification and analysis is called zooarchaeology. When you get diverse animal bones in the archaeological record, even through the height of Maya's socio-political system, which is called the late classic period between about 700 and 900 CE, animal bones never disappear from the archaeological record. In animals in the tropics, they can only breed and rear their young in the forest. So there's a lot of indications that there are always forests nearby. Yes, the Maya had to clear land. Yes, they hunted. Yes, they cut down trees. Yes, they use the forest as a pharmacy, a hardware store, and everything else. But they never abused it. They collaborated with it, which is a difference. Their interaction, their engagement with non-humans always was in mind to ensure their survival, because the Maya knew their survival meant their own survival. Some information we've lost today, which I think is important to remember.
I want to ask, I want to ask you to elaborate a bit more on that, in the sense that probably for many in the audience, it's going to be surprising, this message of the Mayas as a extremely resilient and sustainable society in particular, because I guess the narrative of the idea of collapse in the late classic period, right? So anyone who has read Jared Diamond has probably this idea of the Mayans in that period as a society that was not particularly wise using their natural resources. So what's the deal there, right? So I guess what I want to ask you is, what was misunderstood in the construction of that narrative? What do we know now that gives us the confidence that the story is, if anything, the opposite, one of resilience and of systematic, careful, and we're gonna expand on this symbiosis with the ecology.
Yes, great questions. And well, first of all, the Maya have been farming for 4,000 years without denuding the landscape like we see at present, with monoculture and massive deforestation and the use of chemical and pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers, kind of thing. And there are still 7 million Maya living today and 30 existing Mayan languages. So yes, they are still here. They didn't disappear. What collapsed was Maya kingship, was the hierarchical political system. So in the southern Maya lowlands, those hundreds of cities I mentioned were left empty for the most part. Maya families left kingship when kings failed in doing their duty in supplying clean water in the face of 100-year period where there are over 8 long, severe droughts. So that means the reservoirs, which are replenished by rainfall, and crops, which are rainfall dependent, would have increasingly failed. So that would have resulted in decreasing health, increasing mortality. And so people did what people do today when we talk about climate refugees or immigrants for other reasons. They left to save their families. So what we have, at least 90% of Maya commoners, farmers, the 99%ers left. That's all they did. There's no massive evidence for violence, for killing off the kings. There's some violence, and the Maya were not perfect. There's evidence in some cities for some erosion or some overuse of resources, but it's very localized. You can't say it across the board. But the Maya made the hard decision to leave their homes, and they went in all directions, north, south, east, and west. So the northern lowlands, which is northern Mexico, the Yucatan, the upper northern Yucatan, which has a very different topography. It's much lower elevation, higher groundwater. So there's thousands and thousands of these sinkholes that fill with water, or cenotes. And you have different soils, you have different rainfall patterns. But you see a flourishing of cities in the north when all the people left. Families left for their survival, just like we are seeing today. People will make hard decisions to save their families. That's why families are the main unit of action and social change. We can't look to the governments to save us because they will always look after themselves. So Maya kings and all these hundreds of Maya centers, they just became what they had been before, what their ancestors had been, elite landholders. They also moved north and south. There was a small community of, there's a small number, 10%, about who remained and lived alongside rivers and a few lakes and this kind of thing, and some remained in the cities. If you go visit Tikal, one of the most powerful Maya cities in the Petén in Guatemala, there are still reservoirs that fill with water, even though they haven't been maintained for over 1,000 years. But the droughts are increasingly getting worse, so we are starting to see the desiccation of reservoirs, which never used to desiccate, just because of current global warming and current global climate change, where things are getting drier, unfortunately. So the Maya are still here. What collapsed was the political system. And what everyone else did, they just left.
Let's talk about then the forces behind the resilience of these societies, right? That were largely driven by what was happening at the household level, right? Just following what you described. And the way in which you model this is with the idea of the Mayas as following a non-anthropocentric way of living, right? So I want to hear from you what you mean by that. And I would like to hear how you recognize this and in the data. And there's something that I find particularly interesting. You make reference to the evidence that comes from language, right? And you describe how there's no proper word for nature in Maya languages. So what does that mean? What does that say about this way of living, right? So tell me more about this, please.
Okay, I'm going to answer this in two parts. The first part will be describing the inclusive worldview and how that impacted how they engaged with non-humans, from trees to clouds to soils to water, in terms of collaboration. For example, forest collaboration rather than forest management. So the inclusive worldview is the opposite of the anthropocentric worldview, which is what we follow, where the humans, everything is done to ensure the survival of humans only. Well, the inclusive worldview basically acknowledges that everyone is on the same plane, that everyone and everything has a role to play in maintaining Earth and maintaining the world. It's not necessarily everyone's equal, but everyone plays a role. So why would you kill off something that plays a role in maintaining the Earth? And so everyone is connected, and people connect in the Maya world, traditional Maya worldview, through their souls. So souls are recycled, and so everything connects through their souls. So species are really distinguished per se. And so they focus on renewal. In our way of life, we think in a linear manner. We think of the past, present, and future. We think of economy as limitless growth. We think of progress. Things are moving forward. And Maya think in a circular manner, where everything is renewed. It's about renewal. So death begets life. Life begets death. So it's a continuous renewal. So this renewal cycle has to be acknowledged. And this is done through ritual and through acknowledging the role of others. And the recycling of everything, and through the souls. And this is also reflected in their languages. Mesoamerican languages in general do not have a term for nature because they don't distinguish culture and nature. It's only been in the Renaissance and Enlightenment where Western culture has completely divorced itself from nature. And you see this with the emergence of the Protestant faith and all this kind of thing. That's another story, which is detailed in the book. But there's no term for nature because they didn't distinguish their kinfolk, their other souls from culture. Nor did they have a term for religion. So it's not something people do at night and they pray on their bed or they go worship once a week or every day several times. It's something that was just daily, they're part of their daily existence is just acknowledging others. And that's through family. The extension of family is represented in some of their language too. And also the languages de-emphasize egocentric things. So they de-emphasize me, myself, and I and focus on we. And we includes things like clouds, water, sky, soils, animals, plants, everything, because it's awareness of what's there. And this reflects how they engage with it. Yes, they have to kill, but they acknowledge, they thank the spirit of the animal, the soul, or something comparable. They thank of animals or plants. They acknowledge it traditionally. And so they collaborate with the non-human world in direct ways, like they hunt, they clear, they collect medicinal. Their knowledge of medicinal plants is amazing. And all of the condiments and all the fruits and nuts and berries that you can find in the jungle. And also poisons to stun fish, for example. And all the materials to build thatch structures. And the palm leaves to make waterproof roofs, thatch roofs, for example. So everything comes from the jungle. So you need to take care of it. If you want to go to the store, the pharmacy store, the hardware store, the pharmacy, and the grocery store. That's what the jungle is. In addition to your house gardens, in addition to your fields that they call milpas. And those mimic the forest in terms of their high biodiversity. So one of the things about jungle is you don't find clusters like in the mountains where you find the same cluster of aspen trees or pine tree. Because of the diversity of the soils and the depths and everything else, you don't have clusters of trees or bushes. So everything is diverse. And of course, they support different flora and fauna and bird life and reptiles. So you have just a plethora of different kinds of animals and everything, and flowers and the like. So they mimic this diversity in their fields. They don't just plant one thing. And because of that, it spreads risk. So let's say you plant 10 different kinds of trees and other kinds of plants that produce fruit or pineapple, for example, tobacco, maize, beans, and squash. These are just some, and avocados. These are just some of the few things. And a disease impacts one. It's not going to impact the other. So you still have a plethora of food. And there's other ways they can preserve the different kinds of food, and they're house gardens. So when you go to a traditional Maya home garden today, like one of my foremen, Cleofor Chok, a Mopan Maya who I've known since 1998, watched his kids grow up and hire his sons and now his grandsons. No, not his grandsons yet. That's another family. So they're when you go into their large house lots, it looks sort of like just a plethora of different kinds of trees and plants, but there's no organization. There's no perfect rows like you find in Western ones. But every plant has a purpose. And if some little bushes need shade, they're planted under a tree. So everything has a use. And so when you walk into the jungle with Cleofo, for example, he can name 95% of the species. And same thing with animals and other kinds of things. For example, he and a former student, Colleen Lindsay, collected over 300 different botanical specimens from areas with and without archaeological sites. And over 300, he identified at least 95% of them and their uses. And so I asked him, I said, Cleo, this is amazing, but those ones you could not identify, is there something about them? He says, they had no use. That's it. And there's no Mayan word for weed, by the way. That's, more concept. They have no use, but doesn't mean they're going to kill it. But so the jungle, of course, it probably has been called and some things promoted over others. But things, it's a collaboration, working with. And so another kind of direct collaboration is in their agricultural systems. They have extensive, but they also have terracing. They also have raised fields. They also have, everything is localized. People are so knowledgeable of their local environment. They know how to work with it. in the most efficient way. So you're not going to go in and impose, new techniques from thousands of miles away without understanding. That's why a lot of farmers have, Western farmers have visited trying to try new things without talking to local Maya farmers, and they always fail. And I just have to smirk. And that's just ignorance. And then, okay, another kind of direct collaboration are there settlements? I've excavated commoner households that have been lived in for 1,000 years at least, and they rebuild again and again about every 20 years. It has to do with renewal. It's about rebuilding. And because everything has a soul. So when people die, we have a funeral. Everything is deanimated. Things are deanimated too, or have a funeral. And so there are ceremonies and rites with that. So about every 20 or 30 years, thatch roofs have to be replaced. So it's renewal, and people are buried in the home. They become ancestors. But you cannot live in a place for 1,000 years if you don't take care of the soils around you, the water sources, the forests, because animal bones and the diversity of animal bones in their middens, a fancy term for trash, the diversity of archaeological bones, animal bones, don't change. That means the diverse forests, the different kinds of flora and fauna are still supported, even at the height of population, right before people left. And there's also, so there's how they settle, how they farm, and how they engage with the forest. Those are direct. Indirect are their places for what we would define as places of pilgrimage. I mean, we have special sacred places that we would never farm. We would never desecrate, if you will. And so Cara Blanca that I described in the book is a destination, a pilgrimage destination. It has 25 water bodies. Some are lakes where we do find farmsteads nearby. But the cenotes, which are collapsed sinkholes fed by groundwater, they don't build there. There's great agricultural soils. There's year-round water. Even at the height of the dry season, when I go down there, Hole 1, for example, it's a cenote. It is over 65 meters deep or over 250 feet deep. Yet they didn't build cities there. They didn't farm there. They didn't build anything there except ceremonial buildings. So even at the height of these droughts, they came and they did intensify their ritual, their ceremonial activities at these sites, pleading with the gods and ancestors like Chak, the rain god. Please bring an end to this drought. They didn't. They could have turned their nose up at the gods and ancestors, and they could have built there, but they left with everyone else. So, but because you can't hunt there, because you can't collect things, because you can't farm there, it acts like what we would call the gene bank. So it's like, again, they don't have a term for conservation per se, but that's something we would define. Sacred areas are also conservation areas because you can't do all these things. So the whole Maya lowlands are a mosaic of cities and rural farmsteads and sacred places and forest groves and water places. So the Maya had their own map, and so they didn't map it with extraction zones. They mapped it with other life, with other souls. Okay. For example, and another way they interacted was how they dealt with human waste. We have yet to find in the archaeological record that cities or anywhere latrines. So they likely collected human waste, poop, to use as fertilizer in home gardens, fields, and in the forests. And also, even though the Maya would entomb family under the floors of their houses, the number of remains we have found and based on tombs and some that are buried in caves only represent about 10% of the population. And just to give you an idea, because LIDAR has been done in all of northern Guatemala, they've estimated that during its height that there were at least up to maybe 11 million Maya living in the interior. That's a lot of dying people if you think about it over the centuries, and only 10% are buried. There were no cemeteries. There's no mass burials. Since souls are recycled, but corporal remains are not, they likely recycled human remains to nourish the forest. They were doing their part to maintain the world through the dead because it was the souls that renewed. So Keshol is a Mayan word for infant as well as replacement to show this renewal. So there's a lot of ways the Maya collaborated with through their own, to their own ancestors, if you will, because it's a focus on the souls and how souls connect to other souls of other species.
Tell me more now about the role of cities here at this system, right? So you already mentioned their like seasonal nature and how important they were as the structure to manage water. But how would they look on the ground, right? If we would be able to visit the Cal at its peak, how would that look like, and how is that compatible? A space with such high density of population, how is that compatible with these ways of living that emphasize cyclical practices and so on? Help me getting the urban world into this story.
Well, cities are, there are different sizes, of course, but on average, no matter the size of the city from small to large, they're on average about within 25, 30 kilometers of each other. So they're not that far apart, and they have relations with each other and this kind of thing. But they're no beast of burden. There are roadways, but not a lot because they didn't have the wheel, because you don't have animals to pull them. Because they find in Mesoamerica toys with wheels, so they knew the concept, but you don't have beasts of burden to pull them. So that's one aspect. So what you have are cities and dispersed farmsteads and communities. You don't have villages per se. That's a Spanish imposition to better control them. They forcibly nucleate them into villages called congregación. So you literally have cities and dispersed communities and farmsteads. And again, it was a pulsating system. Dry season, city life. And there are still, of course, people living in the cities full time. During the agricultural intensive period, the rainy season, you had more people dispersed. So this is going to impact our population number estimates if there's more seasonal flow. And in the city, if you went during the late classic period, you would walk on these white causeways. They're plastered. And to make plaster, you need to crush limestone and you burn it, and you add gravel or sand or something and add water to make a plaster. And then all of the cut stone or limestone, because it's karstic topography, the bedrock is all limestone. So you can make blocks. But everything needs to be replastered because of rain. Rain is not kind to anything in the tropics. This is why I'm very envious of my colleagues who work in arid areas where organics preserve, like skin and books and textiles. We will not have that. I say that with absolute envy and jealousy. But and so they compensated for all of this kind of thing. So you had to do a lot of maintenance and also the reservoir. And the temples themselves, they would have been white with red trim, green, blue, red, and what else? And also just the color in terms of the textiles. The woven textiles that are visible in the stone iconography and on the painted vessels shows that even though there's a lot of white in terms of the plastered buildings, there are also a plethora in terms of the textile colors and the designs and the feathers and the jade and the other colors of chert and obsidian stones and the ceramics and all of the fruit. If you look up images of traditional Maya markets, the colors are standing amazing because of all the different kinds of fruits and vegetables, and all the aromas and all of the incense being used, and all of the sounds. There's depictions in the murals and on the scenes of ceramics of flutes and drums. So the music. So there's a lot going on. This is a time to visit, a time to build, work parties and ceremonies and ball games, which also were probably like pickup games, but also inter-center ball games. like to rather than war, let's decide it over a ball game, and also to reenact part of their origin history, which takes place in a ball court in the underworld. So they're multifunctional. So temples, which are pyramid-shaped, stepped or terraced buildings with a structure with several rooms up top, that's your typical Maya pyramid temple, they were also painted white. But we know they used banners. So temples could be for one ceremony, could be designed to for ceremonies for Chak, the rain god, or Inichahau, the sun god, or other gods, or for ancestors. So everything was multifunctional. The roads also act as dams for some of the reservoirs, as also to divert water into the reservoirs from all the surface rain, because all the reservoirs are rainfall dependent as well. They might have started out based on springs, but most reservoirs are rainfall dependent too. So you want to capture all of that rainwater. And gray water is used as well for drinking water. They're gonna be on the hilltops, and then the lower the reservoirs are, the more gray water it is as they're being released. To be used for fish ponds. For construction, you need a lot of water to build plaster, and for agricultural purposes. So water wasn't wasted, and they kept water clean using what we refer to today as constructed wetlands, which you find globally, which use various aquatic plants to maintain water quality. Hydrophytic and macrophytic plants, which I describe in the book as well. But basically, the plants absorb nitrogen and phosphorus, too much of which is not good for human consumption because of algal blooms and because of it promotes waterborne diseases and pathogens. But the biofilms that are created with decomposing aquatic plants also absorb nutrients and consume some of the pathogens. Some bacteria also consume parasites. So it's a whole ecosystem that Maya understood because they've been living for thousands and thousands of years, millennia. They knew how things bred. They knew how things worked. So when they were starting to build these reservoirs that over time became increasingly massive, I'm sure there were mistakes along the way, of course, but by the time they really needed it to supply, Tikal, for example, and Caracola, Belize, and Calakmul, supplied people with water over the 5-month dry season, up to 80 or 100,000 people. That's astounding. And it's all aquatic. Now, they would have had to been dredged, the soils that these plants attached to soils at the bottom, these aquatic plants. So they would have had to dredge it once in a while. But those soils, the muck they dredged is excellent fertilizer because they are saturated with nitrogen and phosphorus, which are perfect to fertilize their urban gardens and fields. They would have to replenish their aquatic plants. They too are saturated with nutrients, perfect to fertilize their urban gardens and fields and forests. So nothing is wasted. We don't find massive dump piles. Everything is reused or repurposed. So that's the main linchpin of Maya power is water. However, they did not listen to their financial advisors to diversify their portfolio, which is one reason they lost power, because they did put all their eggs in one basket as the foundation of their power to attract subjects, to keep subjects during the dry season with these massive reservoirs. When those severe droughts struck, they
Tell me
failed.
more about that, because I'm curious then about the institutional structure that allowed these cities to prosper and this system to work. So what were then the origins of hierarchical differences? How did they look on the ground, this kingship or set of kingships that emerge? How connected were they? What's the story from the politics point of view in these societies?
That's a great question. And I did write a book in 2006 called Water and Ritual, The Rise and Fall of Classic Maya Rulers, which focuses on this. So basically, it's called the first founder effect. So the first come or the first founders are the first servers. So they, of course, acquire the best amounts of land. I mean, they don't buy it. They just sort of start planting it. And then more and more people come because there's great agricultural soils. And if you have great agricultural soils, and even if you don't, they still, the soils that might be poor for agriculture, but they still supply a lot of other products that people can use. And so over time, when more and more people come in, there's smaller and smaller plots of land. And of course, the first comers become the first elites. And they're just like patrons. They organize community events. They're the patrons, and they build the first temples, they fund it. They supply and they fund. But over time, there's more and more people. And there's more needs, there's more administrative needs, where people start to acquire power and demand more from others. They start to demand tribute. There wasn't a currency system per se. They demand it in the terms of goods, services, and labor. But how they acquired it is through domestic rituals writ large, because every person in the Maya world performed ancestral ceremonies, deanimation ceremonies, animation ceremonies, ceremonies to the ancestors in general, to all the major gods. And what you do is you start to hold the ceremonies performing the exact same thing, but on a larger scale. You fund it. And you promote solidarity and sense of membership. But at the same time, you're also inserting a message of why they should be following you, why they should be coming and using your reservoir, why they should be contributing tribute in the terms of goods, services, and labors. Because I can guarantee you, kings did not build the palaces themselves. It's all on the back of their subjects. But you have to work at maintaining that, and that's through ceremony. You also do ceremonies that only rulers do. Of course, you have to distinguish yourself, but you're always performing those rituals that promote the solidarity, that we're all in this together. And those are, so in the archaeological record, you see evidence for these animation rituals, these ancestor veneration rituals, these deanimation rituals. They're just at different scales. So in the commoner houses, for animation, to animate a new house, you have to thank the gods. So you dig a hole and you deposit complete items, and you burn incense, and you build the floor, and that's you've animated the house. And after 20 years, you have to deanimate it. Everything is smashed and broken and burned. And then somebody's buried. So you have this burial and deanimation, animation. So we see stratigraphy in the archaeological record, but it's representing that recycling, that renewal. And so in palaces and temples, you see the exact same stratigraphy. It's just on a much larger scale, with much nicer things. This is why leaders know where to look to find these animation caches, which are beautifully wrought items, sometimes never used, made to be deposited. So, but rulers can only acquire the power of others if there's enough resources in the immediate vicinity. So this is where you have a direct correlation with population size in the amount of plots of these great agricultural soils, amala soils, for example. These are really great, well-drained soils. But in many of these areas, like Tikal has some of the largest amounts of these great soils, Kalakmul. But what they don't have are permanent water sources, hence the reason. But you can either choose an area with great water, but less agricultural soils, or water with lots of agricultural soils, but no water. They can't create soils, which they can actually later, but they can build reservoirs. But every city has its own history. Like Karakol doesn't have a lot of great agricultural soils per se, but it's one of the largest cities, maybe up to 120,000 people live it. But they were surrounded by massive agricultural terraces to compensate for the lack of agricultural soils, which means they chose to live there, to build there for other reasons, like we have to do with portals to the underworld. Caves, any opening in the earth is, including water bodies, are portals to the underworld, and where gods reside, and it's also a means to communicate. So that's so every Maya city has its own story of why they built, but you have to be able to feed people and supply them water. And so those are the basics. And the more you control, the more power you have. The more power you have, the more you can acquire. And the more you can invest, it's very similar to economic systems of what you invest in. And if you're a good investor. And like I said, they did not diversify their portfolio and eventually paid the price. That being said, kingship was around for 1,000 years. And that says something about this pulsating seasonal kind of system.
Let me ask you a final question, and we could spend hours and hours talking about this, but I would like to close with the practical sort of policy orientation of your book, which is very clear and present and interesting. And I would like to hear from you what specific set of practices that you recognize as extensively adopted in the Maya and then the Maya world are feasible to help us today, right? So what can we learn from a practical point of view from ancient Maya societies that we can literally implement in the West at least? Tell me about that.
Well, let me start with water, since that's one of my favorite topics, if you probably could tell. There are over 10 million swimming pools in the United States alone. So voluntarily, it'd be great if people can turn them into natural pools. And there are companies that are creating natural pools where the whole aquatic system becomes a wetland biosphere, a wetland ecosystem. They're self-cleaning. And then create their own pools for drinking water. Now, I don't know the ratio of how much swimming you can do and how much you can drink. Engineers can figure that out. But it's possible. Also, diversify our crops. Because, in terms of resistant kinds of problems we have that our chemicals and our antibiotics can't, diversifying everything spreads the risks and makes things more resilient. So in the field and doing everything, diversifying everything. Also, being aware that individuals can make a difference, that households matter. I mean, let's face it, on tax forms, it says household head. Even the federal government and all governments acknowledge the importance of the household. It's the basic building block. And we cannot forget that every person can do something. We cannot look to get incentives and we can't look to the federal government or any government to supply all the answers and pay for it all. It's going to take everyone, top down and bottom up. So just acknowledging that it's really important. And also, there's so much to learn from traditional and indigenous knowledge that nature-based solutions, for example, is a growing trend in businesses. And many of those, whether or not they acknowledge it, come from traditional ideas, indigenous ideas, and from the past. Lessons from the past is no longer a platitude, it's a fact. And also promote biodiverse forests, expand our parks and have stewards who are indigenous who can, because when they have found that parks who have stewards whose ancestors lived in the same area for millennia, the parks do much better in terms of the biodiversity and the health and well-being of the parks. And you can also, learn more about medicinal things. There's so much that we can learn and collaborate more with. And also just be more conservative with how we hunt. Hunt only what we need and get rid of these ridiculous trophy hunting. And a lot of people aren't going to like what I have to say about pets, but there are hundreds of millions of feral animals that are causing the extinction and impacting biodiversity of things. Of something we created, we domesticated, we created cats and dogs and other pets. And I don't understand when people say they love birds, but they put them in a cage. So, and so I think we need to get rid of breeding pets and take care of the pets we have today. It's very selfish. It's very anthropocentric that we take pets away from their family, and without their permission. We force upon them many things. And no, people are not going to like that idea. And also, right now, we're very single purpose. We can make, like the Maya had causeways that were used as dams and roadways. They could also be used during flooding, not just by humans, but for animals. We can also, and they would also add plant extracts to strengthen the limestone blocks. And the Romans, we know they added something that, 2,000-year-old Roman roads that are still in use, they added something to the cement to make them self-generating kind of thing. There's so much to learn from the past. And also, one of the things I have a major issue is green technology. In my mind, there's no such thing as green technology. Solar panels, electronic vehicles still rely on materials that are mined, and those are finite materials. And the destruction caused by mining is extensive. And they're often in developing countries where people near the mines benefit not at all. They only are impacted by the pollution and the chemicals used and the horrendous things that go along with it. What else is there? Well, migration. We've been migrating since our earliest ancestors left Africa 1.8 to 2 million years ago, Homo erectus. That's part of human nature. And most people have forgotten their immigration stories. Too many people have. And it's just part of who we are, and that's something we need to continue to do. People have been migrating for not only for climate, for many reasons, for, like I said, for at least 2 million years. So that's something that we just have to acknowledge. And green cities, add more green spaces and just be more aware of that. And that's something that more people are familiar with. But one thing is repurposing organic waste in the dead. A lot of land is taken up with cemeteries, which, caskets are not legally required in the United States, for example. And all the wood used and all the metal fixtures, and then people are embalmed, what the leaking embalming fluid does to the local. And so now there are natural burials, you can make compost, there's companies that will do this, grow mushrooms or plant a tree instead of, adding to all of the, and making things worse, to be honest. And also something to do with human waste, turn sewage plants that use chemicals and find natural ways. And increasingly, there are ways to use human waste in more sustainable, natural ways, nature-based solutions. It's just thinking outside the box in terms of that, like, the power of the sun in terms of photosynthesis. Why can't we do something with that? I don't have all the answers how. I'm just saying we have to think outside the box. And become more multi-purpose. And one type of green energy source is humans. There are over 8 billion of us. So we can start focusing more on these labor-intensive projects using screwdrivers and hammers and basic kinds of equipment instead of replacing everything with AI and robotics. I mean, AI data centers require so much energy and water. And people forget and don't realize that water is finite. We are drinking the same water that dinosaurs did, recycled. It is finite. So we have to take care of it. And using it to cool data centers is very short term. We have to get away from anthropocentric, short term, technocentric ideas and just open our mind to being more inclusive of non-humans. Because even if we do everything to encourage the survival of Homo sapiens, us, it's absolutely moot if we don't take care of the environment around us. So we might survive, but we will cause our own extinction if we don't take care of the air. You can't use money and wave it in the air to clean it. You can't eat money, nor can you put it in water to clean it. It's just a value created out of nothing. So we have to redefine what value is and what we value.
Thank you, Lisa. This has been a great conversation, and that's probably a great way of ending it. Thanks for also writing the book. I love the applied spirit of it. It's a great way, I think, of pushing us in academia to try to do something that has a practical impact. And so I applaud that. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. And I do want to end by thanking my associates in Belize. I could not have done what I've done to this day and written the book without them, and they are quoted with their permission in the book. I learned so much from them. I am astounded to what I learned from them. So I want to end it with that. So thank you, Javier.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Economic and Political History Podcast. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged. Thank you and take care.